What began as a limited military operation is now threatening to spill into something far larger. The confrontation involving the United States, Israel, and Iran no longer looks like a contained exchange of strikes. It is starting to resemble the early stages of a much broader regional conflict, one that could stretch across multiple fronts and pull in actors that were previously trying to stay on the sidelines. At the center of this crisis is a basic shift in objectives. For years, the goal of pressure campaigns against Iran was to weaken its influence, contain its regional reach, and reduce its ability to threaten rivals through missiles, proxy groups, and strategic intimidation. But if recent events are any indication, the objective may be changing. This no longer appears to be only about containment. It increasingly looks like an attempt to break Iran's strategic position altogether. Reports of major explosions in and around the Iranian capital, combined with strikes on military and government-linked sites, suggest a campaign aimed not just at infrastructure, but at the leadership structure itself. Whether or not every report is confirmed, the message is clear. This is no longer just about degrading capabilities. It is about creating shock, disorientation, and political pressure at the highest levels. And that changes everything. When a state believes it is being pushed toward strategic collapse, it stops thinking in terms of limited retaliation. It starts thinking in terms of survival. That is what makes this phase especially dangerous. Once a conflict becomes existential in the eyes of one side, escalation becomes far more likely, even if the military balance is unfavorable. Iran cannot match the United States and Israel in a conventional war. That much is obvious. But that does not mean it lacks options. It means its response is more likely to come through indirect pressure, regional disruption, and asymmetric retaliation rather than a head-on military contest. That is why the battlefield may not remain limited to one country or one front. If the conflict widens, the surrounding region could become the real center of gravity. Strategic facilities, shipping corridors, military bases, energy infrastructure, and allied governments all become potential pressure points. In that environment, even countries that do not want war may find themselves pulled into it by geography alone. From Washington's perspective, strong early action may be seen as the best way to establish deterrence and force Iran onto the defensive. There's also a political logic behind that view. If previous high-risk actions produced only limited blowback, decision-makers may conclude that the risks of escalation are manageable. Success in earlier crises can create a dangerous kind of confidence, especially when opponents appeared unable or unwilling to respond in full. But history has a habit of punishing leaders who assume the next crisis will behave like the last one. Military buildups, long-range aircraft deployments, carrier strike groups, and forward-position assets all provide flexibility and power projection. They create options, but they also create expectations. Once that machinery is in motion, it becomes easier to widen the mission than to narrow it. A campaign that begins with selective strikes can quickly evolve into a broader effort to destroy military networks, leadership structures, and political resilience. That kind of strategy may produce tactical success. It may destroy facilities, eliminate commanders, and weaken deterrence networks. But it also raises the stakes for the opposing side. A government that feels cornered may decide that absorbing punishment quietly is more dangerous than escalating in ways that impose pain elsewhere. And that is where Iran's logic comes in. If Tehran believes that restraint will only invite more attacks, then escalation starts to look less like recklessness and more like necessity. Not because it can win a direct war, but because it needs to change the political calculations of its opponents. In that situation, the goal is not battlefield victory. The goal is to make the cost of continuing the war feel unacceptable. There are several ways that can happen. One is through attacks on military bases and personnel connected to the United States or its partners. Even limited casualties can have an outsized political effect, especially if public support for war is already weak. Another is economic disruption, particularly in energy markets. Any threat to shipping routes or oil infrastructure can create consequences far beyond the battlefield. The result is pressure not only on governments in the region, but also on leaders in Washington facing domestic economic fallout. There is also a third layer to this strategy: political leverage through regional instability. If neighboring states begin to suffer repeated attacks, economic losses, or internal security shocks, they may try to pressure all sides to contain the war before it reaches their own core interests. That creates another pathway for Iran to influence the conflict without needing to win militarily in the traditional sense. But this is also where Iran faces a major risk. Efforts to pressure regional states can just as easily push them in the opposite direction. Instead of demanding de-escalation, they may decide that Iran itself has become the main source of instability and support a larger coalition against it. In trying to widen the cost for its enemies, Tehran could end up widening the war against itself. This is what makes the current moment so volatile. Each side believes it understands the limits of the other. Washington may believe Iran will avoid the kind of escalation that invites overwhelming retaliation. Iran may believe the United States lacks the political endurance for a prolonged regional war. Both assumptions may prove dangerously incomplete, and that is often how major conflicts grow, not simply because leaders want a wider war, but because they act on theories about what the other side will tolerate. They push, test, signal, and gamble. Then one assumption fails, one red line is crossed, and the crisis enters a phase nobody originally planned for. That may be where this confrontation is heading now. The real danger is not only the strikes that have already happened, it is the logic now driving them. Once both sides believe escalation is the only language the other understands, diplomacy becomes harder, restraint begins to look like weakness, and every response sets the stage for the next one. At that point, wars no longer expand by accident alone. They expand because every player becomes convinced that backing down is more dangerous than pressing forward. And when a conflict reaches that stage, the question is no longer whether the region is under pressure. The question is how many fronts can ignite before someone finally decides the cost has become too high.